So I work as a science writer and a journalist. That means basically that I write about science for the general public. So I spend my days identifying new research or really great stories in science, and then I report them, which means I do interviews with scientists, I visit labs, I read a lot of scientific papers, and then I write up those stories into articles for national magazines. I primarily write for places like Scientific American, Discover, as well as ones that have a more scientific audience, as well as such as Nature or The Scientist magazine. On a daily basis, I read a lot. I do a lot of phone interviews with scientists. And then I spend a lot of my time outlining, writing, and editing stories. To be a science writer, you need some type of a background in science, but it doesn't have to be intensive training. So I would say at least a college degree in some area of science. Mine is in biology. I studied biology as an undergraduate, but I don't think you need a PhD. You just really need an interest and a willingness to learn. For example, last week I wrote a story about plant DNA and how sort of different and strange a plant's genome can be from ours. I don't know anything about plants at all, really, but I can tell you now all about lots of different kinds of plants, like this strange aquatic carnivorous plant called a bladderwort. I could tell you all about that. And a week ago, I didn't know anything about it. So you just have to be willing to learn a lot very often. Be a student at heart. To explain complicated science concepts to the general public, there's a lot of different techniques you can use. Very often, we journalists use plenty of metaphors and similes. I write a lot about molecular biology, and that can be especially hard because you can't see it. It's not like an elephant or a gorilla that are, easy to talk about and visualize. So we use a lot of comparisons, like DNA is often compared to a blueprint for an organism, just like you would use a blueprint to build a building. Um, Another technique is to really quote scientists as real people. So rather than quoting the scientists using some type of jargon, like for that plant story I was describing, this event called polyploidy, which is when two genomes of different species combine. Well, that's kind of complicated. So instead, I had a scientist who was talking to me, and he described it as this illicit affair between two different plants that basically had plant sex. So I used those words instead because that was a lot more interesting and sort of gives you the idea better than trying to use the scientific jargon. So one of the most interesting stories that I wrote was my very first feature that I ever wrote as a young science writer. And it was about the ways that animals like embryonic chicks and salamanders can regrow their body parts, which is something that us mammals can't do. So we're really interested in how they do it to see if someday we could figure that out. Um, so I went to this laboratory and watched them. Actually, they were regenerating the lens out of the eyes from different animals. So I watched them remove the lenses from the eye of a chick in an egg and from a newt. And that was amazing. And they've actually found all these little molecular sort of keys and signals that the animals use that humans and other mammals don't use. So to try to see if they could apply them to us. So that was a great story. Recently, I wrote a story about adding a sense of touch to prosthetics. If you think about your hand, if you're outside and it gets really cold and your fingers get all numb, and try to imagine trying to pick up something fragile, even just like a potato chip. It's really hard. It's hard even when you have this sort of less sense of touch in your fingertips. Then imagine having no sense of touch, which is what prosthetics for arms and hands currently have. So it's really hard for people with a prosthetic to say, look away and try to pick up a can of soda. Very often they don't know how hard they're squeezing and they can just burst the can. So there's a company who's trying to create devices that put a sense of touch back into a prosthetic. So I went and visited this company out in San Francisco, and they're making fingertip sensors that are actually even more sensitive than our own fingertips. And I met a young man who was missing his arm, and he tried them out for me and showed me how cool he thought they were and how helpful. So it was this really new cutting edge technology that I, as a journalist, got to get in and see before anybody else really. And the story got a lot of feedback. People were really interested in this technology. So that was one of the most interesting ones I've done recently. So as a self-employed freelancer, I am my own boss, which can be really nice. I make my own hours during the day, which works out well for me because I tend to think and write better early in the morning, and not so much in the afternoon and at nighttime. It means that I write for a variety of magazines, and work with a variety of different editors. There's not just one magazine or one newspaper that I work for. And I can work on a lot of different projects. In fact, I write mostly for magazines, but I've also recently been writing a biology textbook for college students as well. So I get to try lots of different things. It can be hard. I work at home. There can be a lot of distractions. At the same time, it's nice to set, my own vacation schedule. And but you do have to work hard because I have to go out and get each of my own assignments. I have some editors who send me work, but a lot of the times I'm looking for stories and then trying to pitch them to magazines to say, hey, this is a cool story. Will you pay me to write about it? And you want them to say yes, but they don't always say yes. So I got interested in the field of science writing because I really liked biology and I took every biology class I could as a college student, but I really did not like the lab. I sort of hated following protocols and you know, using test tubes and it just wasn't fun. But I like to think about biology and talk about it. So I ended up going to graduate school at MIT in Boston to learn science journalism. They have a specific program in that. So there was where I learned how to do interviews and talk to scientists, and I got a background in some other fields of scientists that I wasn't as familiar with, such as environmental science. Um, After that, I did an internship at a magazine. That was really the best sort of hands-on experience that I could have had being right in a newsroom. And from there, I started freelancing and just worked really hard to write stories and get in a variety of different magazines. And now I have enough what we call clips, which are stories that I've written in the past that helps me get new jobs in the future. So it's become a pretty steady career, and I haven't lacked for work. So that's been great. So for students interested in pursuing a career in science writing, the first thing you can do and the easiest is just to start reading the type of things that you think that you would like to write someday. So if you like nature and history, get a subscription to the Smithsonian and read that every month. Or if you like technology and gadgets, then maybe you get a subscription to Wired. They have some really great feature stories every month. And so just by reading what other writers do, you can get a sense of it. You start to learn more about the field that you're interested in. Um, and then just as far as your journalism chops, you could try to start writing for your school paper. And even if your high school doesn't have a paper, you could start one, just a short flyer or a small newspaper, and get some other kids who are interested in writing and just, put out some stories. It doesn't have to be that often, maybe once a month or even once or twice a semester, and just get used to writing because if you think you might want to be a writer, you got to see if you like to do that often.